We live in times where adaptation to sustainable agriculture production practices is critical. Most times, we only focus on crop yield and livestock throughput, but soil health and soil preservation are equally important to a profitable farming enterprise. The world has also become curious on how we produce our food and how our current practices influence future crop and livestock production systems, the health and longevity of the planet while maintaining a balance in everything we do. Now more than ever is the time to practice smart agriculture. Coming to you live from DB Audio Studios in Windhoek, this is the Bank Windhoek Agriculture Series brought to you in collaboration with the GIZ, the Namibian Nature Foundation, and the Namibia Organic Association. This event will be four-part series on transforming to smart agriculture practices under the following themes: regenerative rangeland management for climate change adaptation, organic agriculture, food and nutrition security, agriculture economics and marketing, and lastly, the role of the banking industry in financing climate change initiatives. We are broadcasting live on the Bank Windhoek Facebook and YouTube social media channels. Welcome, my name is Maria Immanuel, your moderator for this series. I encourage you to engage us by asking questions on our Facebook as we proceed, and by the end of our presentations, our speakers will strive to answer your questions. Good morning. To start off this exciting four-part series, our first topic this morning will focus on regenerative rangeland management. To shed more light on this very interesting topic, I now turn to our speakers and would like to welcome Mr. Colin Nott, a Namibian regenerative consultant who is well known in the agriculture sector, and our international guest speaker, Dr. Christine Jones, soil ecologist and expert on regenerative agriculture practices. She's joining us from Australia today. Before, I would just like to highlight Mr. Colin Nott's background. As I mentioned, he's a Namibian citizen and he holds a degree in rangeland science. He's a certified educator in holistic management and now a regenerative consultant. He has spent the last 30 years in Namibia working in natural resource sector with a focus on conservation, agriculture, rangeland management and wildlife conservation. Recently, he has worked with a range of Namibian farmers, including the 3 Farmers Union, and the Ministry of Agriculture to develop the 2019 revised rangeland management strategy for Namibia. Colin is currently engaged with this Farmers Union to facilitate changes in the livestock and crop value chain to support mechanisms that regenerate soil life with the ultimate aim of improving the productivity and profitability of the crop and livestock in Namibia. Dr. Christine Jones, who's our guest speaker for today, is an active participant and supporter of an Australia movement into a soil carbon accreditation scheme, with numerous journals and publications produced on regenerative land management techniques. She's an expert on the treatment and maintenance of Australia's large and vast environmental resources. Christine completed a Bachelor of Science degree with first-class honors, followed by her PhD at the University of New England, New South Wales, where she gained her expertise on air, land, and water science. Both our speakers this morning are highly regarded in their field, and we are honored to have their input. Welcome, Colin, and welcome, Dr. Jones. Colin, I want to start with you. You have worked in the agriculture sector your whole life, and you are currently a regenerative consultant, and obviously you have also worked with the Agriculture Union, both the NNFU, the NAU, as well as the emerging farmers. And I want to start by you providing us a context on regenerative practices in Namibia. Looking at the agriculture sector in Namibia, we are aware that the agriculture sector has experienced decline over the years. Our resource base has also declined, and also positioning the agriculture sector as the key sector for the recovery, for the economic recovery post-COVID-19. So please, I'll hand over to you so you can just give us where are we, what have we done, and what can we do as a country to actually regenerate the agriculture sector. and to revive that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Maria, and thank you, Christine, and all the organizers for this opportunity to be here today. I'll be talking today mainly about the priorities that have been developed by the 3 farmers' unions together with the Ministry of Agriculture and Land Reform, and focused on crop production as well as livestock production. And as you say, it's very important that we take stock of where we are now. And it's interesting to look at some of the figures. Our country is about 80 million hectares big. 60 million hectares of that is suitable for rangeland production, for livestock production. And almost all of that 60 million hectares has degraded to some extent, and often very severely, and we'll look at that in a minute. Of the 60 million hectares which has degraded, about 45 million hectares of that is severely bush thickened, which also reduces the productivity of our lands. Our soil cover, our biodiversity, and our productivity has declined over time. Our crop practices often involve disc harrowing, which has a very negative impact on our soils. It pulverizes the soils and breaks soil structure. And our yields, particularly in some of the communal areas, are incredibly low, almost 400 kilograms per hectare, which is incredibly low. And our rangelands now only support half of the livestock they could 50 to 100 years ago. So we're dealing with a industry, farmers who are highly exposed to droughts. They are not resilient any longer. The industry is in decline. And as a result, the Namibian economy is struggling because many countries who are aiming to industrialize do that on the back of a thriving agricultural sector. And I think what is really interesting is that our dry climates, particularly on the rangeland side, require that we manage our rangelands differently and think differently about them to how you would manage in some of the wetter climates of the world. So if we look at this in Namibia's situation, we are not alone. About 40% of the global surface is considered drylands, and almost all of those are in decline. So the initiatives which Namibia is embarking on don't just affect our country, they affect 40% of the land surface of the planet. And there's an international movement which is underway to look at soils differently in dry climates and look at ways of treating those soils differently which can get them to regenerate. So here's a slide that's up on the screen, and Christine may recognize this because I think we've stolen it from one of her presentations. It is included in our rangeland strategy. And really what it shows is that our soils at one point were healthy. They have lost productivity, they have lost organic carbon, and they're now losing soil moisture. I'm not going to talk about this because Christine, this is her bread and butter. She's going to tell us exactly how this works and what happens with this. But the most important thing is that our land is in decline. And because our land is in decline, our people are getting poorer, our quality of life is getting worse. And this has social and political implications for the country going forward. But it's not all bad. Namibia has a number of things in place within the country. We have a good climate change policy. We have a very good national rangeland management policy and strategy. We work collaboratively between the unions and the ministry to develop the regenerative livestock strategy, which is envisaged to revitalize the Namibian livestock industry. We have very good conservation agriculture strategies and programs that are in place. And these all offer opportunities for us to work into the future and to upscale some of the initiatives which are showing real potential. And I think this is really where the unions have focused and have just based their priorities on this. Now, there's often a question, is our decrease in production on our lands, is it climate change based or is it management based? All we can say from a practical perspective is that management has a huge impact. There are farms, and on the screen at the moment, there's a farm on the right-hand side, which has 3 times the number of livestock as those on the left-hand side. The right-hand side is perennial grasses. It has a good water cycle, a good mineral cycle, not that bush encroached, but it has a regenerative grazing plan. And it is that grazing plan and the timing of utilization of plants which has allowed it to recover and to restore and even exceed the productivity of what was there before. On the left-hand side of the picture, as I said, there's a third of the amount of livestock on there. It's annual grass dominated. There's lots of bare ground. It's bush encroached. But critically, there is no grazing plan. That is continuous grazing. The livestock are moving across the land as they will, and perennial grasses have been lost from that and highly unproductive. So in that situation, the understocked area has degraded, and what some people would consider the overstocked scenario has really encouraged the system to move forward. And I think this is something critical that we've looked at in the strategy, and we're relying on people like Christine to give us the background and the understanding of what's going on there. We can see that it's happening, but we don't always understand why. And once we understand why it's all happening, that makes it much easier to explain to farmers and for farmers to take the action that's needed. So if we look at the regenerative livestock strategy, which was produced in 2019, the key points of that is that we're getting a better understanding of what it takes to regenerate our lands, to get the production back to our rangelands. We've also shown, and farmers themselves have shown, the early adopters and the innovators have shown that it can be done, because they have doubled their stocking rates over the last 20 years by applying good regenerative practices. Not only is it possible, we've shown that it's economically viable and that farmers become more profitable once they change to these kinds of practices. So it's not only possible, but it is profitable. The other thing that we do know is that because the degradation is so severe, it is really difficult for farmers to make these changes themselves and in isolation. What we know is that we need an industry response. The whole industry needs to make changes at every level. Farmers need to change their practices, but they need support from the entire industry, the banking sector, the policy environment, and the input suppliers. Various institutions, banking institutions, need to change the way they are doing things so everybody enables and supports the transition from farmers' current practice to regenerative practices. We know farmers are often very reluctant to change. They don't like to change. But once farmers see that it is working and there are incentives and there are approaches which encourage them to change, then we'll see that farmers do move in that direction. And this is where we are really looking at, and I'll go into it in some detail, is that the industry is already investigating price incentives and also talking to the banks to look at innovative loan schemes which can support the transition from current practice to future practice. We also know that we've got to do things differently to how we did things before. Namibia, not compared to Australia, but it's a big country, it's a vast country, with large distances between farmers, and it is very expensive to use the current support mechanisms where you drive to a farmer and you talk to them about what's going on the farm. So we've recognized that we need to have a combination of that, but supplement that with good digital platforms and information, that a lot of learning can take place remotely, and farmers can all learn and change at their own pace. So there are a number of changes that need to take place. And if we get these things in place, we are convinced that we will get the soil organic matter back into the soil. Our net primary production will increase once more, and this will enable perennial grasses to come back and make the industry not just more productive, but more resilient. The drought that we had over the last 3 or 4 years is a drought, and we will face more droughts in future. Yeah. But our farmers were not resilient to that drought because their farming was based on annual grasses and not perennial grasses. Yeah. So we've had a massive decline in livestock numbers, huge impacts on quality of life, and it's going to be a real struggle for those farmers to get back on their feet, to get their animal numbers up, because animals are required to regenerate. And I think this is something that we must recognize in the dry climates of the world. If a dry climate like ours has degraded, you will need animals properly managed to restore that productivity. The overall strategy that's being used by the unions is there's a good talk by Simon Sinek which explains this, and the world generally is made up in a bell curve of different kinds of people, and you have a very small proportion of the population who are the innovators. They create new things, and the Steve Jobs, these people in the world, they create new things. Then you get the early adopters. The early adopters have their radars out, and they are picking up what's not working on their farm, and they find out what's going on, and they will change their practices irrespective of what anybody tells them. As long as it's people aren't standing in their way, and we see this in Namibia, we see this in all the dry climates, the early adopters have almost taken over and are leading the science at some point. I don't think anymore. I think now Christine and others are explaining what was happening, but at one point, as a range scientist myself, we could see farmers were doing things, but we couldn't explain why that was happening that way. But it's important that you don't just have the early adopters, because that's 13% normally of the population that you have. Now, in order for a movement like this to become successful, you have to get the early and late majority of farmers also on board and applying regenerative practices. Now, they're nearly 70% of the population, so without them, you can't say you've been successful. You can say it can be done, but farmers won't change because of those few people. So I think the strategy that the unions are looking at using is to develop incentives to pull farmers and to encourage farmers to change what they're doing and to move from where they are to change to a regenerative practice. So the priorities which the agricultural unions have come up with are divided into two areas, really. The one which is crop-based and initially just focused on the communal areas, because that's where we believe the biggest impact can be had. This is not the biggest proportion of land in the country, but it supports the largest population of people within the country. These are these small ecove, the fenced-off areas within the communal lands where you have a central homestead within an ecove, and around that you have your crop field, but then there are also areas which aren't cropped, which might just have grasslands or other things in it. And if you look at an aerial view of the northern communal areas, it's a patchwork of these 10-hectare areas. Now, if you increase the productivity and profitability of each of those 1 to 10 or 20-hectare areas, you increase the productivity of the entire region. And I think this is what's being looked at, and one approach, which is a conservation agriculture approach, is being planned to be promoted and upscaled by the unions. And this is a specific approach to Namibia because our soils in many of the communal areas have a very 10 or so centimeters below the surface, have a hard pan, which restricts root growth and restricts crop development and yields. So ripper furrowing has been trialed and tested by the Ministry of Agriculture together with farmers and has proven to be exceedingly efficient. And in the first year, we can see yields going at least doubling, and we see yields going to 3, 4, 5 tons per hectare, where the national average is 400 kilograms per hectare. So this can have a major impact. The demand is there. Farmers are wanting to have this approach applied on their lands. And the idea is to work with entrepreneurs within the north, organize innovative tractor loans for them to get tractor loans, link those tractors now to the farmers who would like that land preparation to be applied to their farms, through some kind of app development, and this will allow an efficient use of those tractors, and we will get increased yields. Also, using a platform, we can reach farmers about the information, what should be done, when it should be done, how it should be done, and all of this can be done through phones, even if they're not smartphones. So this is one of the approaches which is being pursued, and we really do believe that it has huge potential in the north and other communal areas. In this photograph here, you can see the yield on the left-hand side is from the same farmer in the same year, just in adjacent fields. The yield on the left is with disc harrowing. The yield on the right is from a ripper furrowed crop field, and just showing that the average in that year was double, that the yield of the same farmer in the same rainfall season, on average, we doubled yields in that particular year. The picture down below shows how the settlement, this is in Kavango, how settlement, the small fenced-off areas we're talking about, you can see the cropped areas there, the little squares which are joined, and what's happening is that those are effectively, in some areas, joining up, and the whole area is that kind of approach. So the second priority that the unions have decided to look at, and this involves the title deed land as well as the communal land, is to look at improving the rangeland management practices within our rangelands and to enable farmers to apply grazing plans which will be regenerative. So here remote learning modules have been developed, and particularly during COVID, we couldn't travel, but we developed remote modules. Farmers were able to learn and experience and gain information from that. We're working with WhatsApp groups in the interim until we get some kind of platform where it's more organized, where the learning can be structured. And this is what we're hoping to do in the next years. This is our start, but we decided to get things, the unions decided to get things moving. And the idea is to work with the early adopters to gain information and knowledge from them about how it does work, because they have done it, they have experienced it, and we can learn a lot from them. So we're also working with Meatco and the Meat Board to certify products and the various certification levels that are being looked at, but it is more or less a tiered system that you would have animal welfare, then you would have regenerative farmers, and then you would have organic farmers, with different levels of certification, provided that we can access international markets which are prepared to pay a premium. More and more consumers are becoming aware of where things are produced, what impact it has on the land, but not just what impact it has on the land, what impact it has on the people. Is it socially responsible? Is it environmentally responsible? And is it economically sustainable? So we're busy with that, and we're also busy talking to the banks to look at innovative loan schemes to support farmers to transition. So the major priority at the moment also is to create an enabling environment in the communal areas. At the moment, 30 million hectares of our country cannot access regenerative livestock practices because if you do develop a grazing plan, you cannot enforce it. If somebody from within that community decides they're not going to follow the grazing plan, there's nothing that can be done about it. So the idea here is for the unions to work with the ministry, with other stakeholders, to talk to farmers about the different environmental and social setups within the communal areas, and let farmers devise the mechanisms themselves as to what will enable a grazing plan to be applied. So that will be done while these other practical initiatives are already starting. That might take some years or some time to work with those early adopters, because we do have early adopters in the communal areas too, who are changing practices to try and improve their rangelands. So the idea is to develop a digital support platform, and that here again information will be available. You'll be able to gain information about your area, about your production that year. We're hoping to look to people like Christine to see whether we can later remotely sense soil carbon, and if we can do that, or how do we now assess remotely what progress farmers are really making, because farmers will want to be doing it at their level, but at a national scale, we do need to monitor bare ground, we do need to monitor soil cover, and we do want to monitor what's going on in the soil. And I'm sure some clever people will help us with that at some point in time. Because the more we can do remotely is much better, because going out and measuring grass plants with a stick, many farmers are not prepared to do that, and it's just too time consuming. So there are various grazing methods which have been tried and tested, and these we would like to make available to farmers for them to choose. Once a farmer has chosen an approach, we then like to be able to support that farmer to apply that approach. And here, farmer working groups, learning groups between farmers, where farmers collaborate and then have some external expertise coming in and assisting them, is what's being looked at. Now, another very interesting development by the three unions is the development of a Namibia Agricultural Industry Committee. Because we've recognized that you can't, farmers cannot do this alone, it's important that the industry gets together, and the unions have organized the first industry committee meeting. People have met, and this is where we find ourselves in the process at the moment, where we're still working together with the industry, to meet with the industry, to see what their needs are, and how they can contribute to these various priorities that we've laid out here. Because it should be in everybody's interest to grow the industry. The banks, if they're engaged with it, if we grow the agricultural industry, they will grow their business. We're not asking for grants to come and support what the unions want to do. This must grow everybody's business. It's important that Meatco is engaged, because once we get perennial grasses going, they'll get better quality meat coming through the facility, but it'll also be more resilient, and we won't have these massive sales and then massive drop-offs in sales, which really affects the business, and it will make added value more. It will enable added value to become more of a feature, and it'll be much more stable. So this is really, the industry committee is critical, and the three unions are in the process of setting up an organization which will require to be funded, which involves all three unions, which will take forward these priorities where the unions have agreement on and where they can collaborate and work together. So the priorities I think I've mentioned. There will be innovative regenerative loan schemes, appropriate digital support and mentorship, and proof of concept. One of the things we're looking at here is there are other initiatives, and Chile is one example, where it could be introduced relatively quickly into the country, even in this upcoming growing season, which will enable farmers to engage with a crop which already has a market access. And if that value chain can be organized and farmers can engage with it, then this could be very useful. So there are major impacts from livestock production. After 10 years, we envisage 500,000 additional income to livestock producers after 10 years. And from the conservation agriculture, we see 800 million going to 30,000 farmers after 10 years. So it's reaching a large number of people, but also a significant injection of money into those issues. So in terms of some closing remarks, I think the unions are busy engaging with the industry. We are busy engaging with farmers at the local level. We are busy working with early adopters. We're in the early stages of making this vision a reality. And time will tell, and we are hopeful that the industry will engage and that we will be able to attract both international expertise as well as international money to help Namibia achieve this goal of revitalizing its agricultural sector and thereby revitalizing the Namibian economy. And we would see 3 to 5 billion Namibian dollars being added to the GDP after 10 years, which is a significant amount to our country, and put agriculture back in the place where it should be in terms of productivity in the country. So, Maria, that's some words from the unions.
Thank you so much. I think it's very interesting and very comforting to to know that the sector is organized, because I think that is the key to success. And as I mentioned before, agriculture being really the focus sector for the towards the economic recovery, looking at where we have been in the last 6 months. So thank you very much for that interesting topic and good insight and practical insight as well on what is happening in the country on the ground, Colin. And I would just like to remind our viewers that please engage us on our Facebook, on the Bank Windhoek Facebook. Put down your question, and then at the end of the presentation, we will come back and address that accordingly. Now, Dr. Jones, we are quite excited to have you as our guest speaker today, and you are with us in Australia right now. I know it's about 5 to 6 p.m. As a soil ecologist, would you give us an overview on the fundamental of soil, also looking at Namibia as a country, looking at where we are probably the most affected country when it comes to climate change, and of course looking at our production decline, and also looking at all these gains that Colin has highlighted that we are trying to achieve in the industry to get our agriculture sector up and kicking. Please, over to you, Doctor. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Maria, and thank you, Colin, for an absolutely fascinating introduction, and what a fantastic overview of the issues that are facing Namibia. And I couldn't think of anybody better, really, than you to be there helping sort it all out, because you have incredible passion for what you're doing, and for everything from the soils, the plants, the livestock, the people. I think the thing that has really attracted me about regenerative agriculture in every country in the world where that term is now being used is that it's very people-centered. It's really about the farmers and about the change and about the psychology of change and what we need to do to enable farmers to achieve the outcomes that we all want for improved landscape function, but improved quality of food, and also for the economy. You know, if we want to improve, as you so beautifully put it, all of those things are connected, obviously. And I think, well, certainly in Australia, we unfortunately are still seeing a situation where the government does not support farmers. I'm not really sure why. I guess we have other industries, and farming is just considered. There was even a document went around Canberra at one stage to say that we didn't even need agriculture in this country, that we could just simply focus on, you know, other kinds of industries, and we could import all of the food that we needed from elsewhere. Well, I'd have to say that this year that wouldn't have really worked very well with the situation that we found ourselves in. But there was also, just very shortly after that, there was a volcanic explosion and a lot of ash in the atmosphere, and none of the planes could get into Australia for a little while. So, you know, this idea of importing our food from overseas was obviously not a good one. So yes, we do have to be more resilient, as you pointed out, and in order to do that, to increase our productivity and also to increase the resilience of it, because I'm sure there are so many similarities between Namibia and Australia in terms of we have incredible climatic variability here, and we have had climatic variability for thousands of years. We kind of swing from well, we have what we call La Nina and El Nino events, and it's either going to be dry for years on end, or we're going to have flooding. So we go from droughts to flooding rains, basically. And I guess that's very similar in a lot of other dry landscapes around the world. I know that the United States suffers from the same kind of climatic variability. So what we're really, I don't really particularly like that word climate change. I think what we have to have is resilience in the face of climatic variability, because it affects every country, and it has been like that for hundreds, if not thousands of years. So I'm going to, I hope, show you some slides. Now, when I tried to show these before, the host has disabled my screen sharing. I don't know why. I tried to load them before and I got the sign that says the host has disabled my screen share. Can somebody please enable screen share so I can show my slides? I have several. I have 100 slides here that I would love to show you if I could please have them enabled.
All right. Can you try again, Doctor? It's enabled now.
Okay. Thank you. Lovely.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Why is that? Get out of the way there. Okay, can you see that? Can you see that?
Yes, yeah, we can. We can see. We can see.
Oh, lovely. Okay. So Colin has described the production side of things, the conservation agriculture and the rangeland management type approaches that
Doctor,
are being taken in.
Sorry, Doctor, can you enlarge your presentation? Sorry about that. Can you enlarge your presentation just a bit for us to have a better view?
Sorry, can you say that again, Maria?
Can you please enlarge your presentation?
Well, it's showing full screen to me.
Okay. All right.
I have no idea.
Okay, you can continue. Please go ahead. Please go ahead.
Okay. So it's occupying the entirety of my screen. I don't know why it's not doing that for you. That's technical. Sorry, that's not
all
right.
Not a problem.
So I hope you can see something. Anyway. All right. So I have an hour here to talk about basically how soil works and how that relates to all of the things that we're talking about in agriculture. So I'm going to give an overview of how soil actually functions, because if we don't understand the processes of how soil works, we don't know what it is that we need to do to get leverage on, like how can we very quickly restore soil function. We have to understand how it works. And as a general rule, almost everywhere I go in the world, there's very, very little understanding of how soil actually functions as a living system. I'm very briefly going to mention biostimulants because that's important for your northern cropping sector, something that's really, really going to help them to move away from synthetic fertilisers and stimulate plant growth. A little bit about plant diversity, because regenerative agriculture around the world has basically been based on plant diversity, which is something that has really been missing from agricultural systems in the past. And then, of course, grazing management, which is, I mean, that's, you know, Colin's expertise is in that area, and he has far more expertise than I on that. But I will just talk about how grazing management actually affects what happens underground and how grazing management affects bush encroachment, which is obviously very significant for Namibia. So how soil works, basically it's now been very well established in the literature that photosynthesis is the driver for soil function, and that's because it's the exudates that come from plant roots that are the primary pathway for soil building. So if photosynthesis is right up there as number one, then this is why, like what kinds of plants have we got? How much of the year do we have plants there? How many different kinds of plants do we have? And in a grazing situation, how do we manage those plants? What we're really doing is managing photosynthesis, because that's important for crop production and important for animal production, but it's very, very important for soil building. So it has this dual role of building a plant that's going to be something that people can consume or animals can consume, but also building soil. And I guess that's what the rest of my talk is really about. How do we stimulate photosynthesis through our management? And as Colin explained, it's management is the important thing. So our actively growing green plants, obviously we have to have a green plant to be photosynthesizing. It's going to support the microbes. And it is the microbes that actually create what we all want everywhere in the world, which is well-structured, friable topsoil with a high nutrient status and high water holding capacity. I mean, that's what every farmer everywhere in the world wants for their soils. The only thing that can form that kind of topsoil, microbes are the only thing that can build soil. And the only way that we can have microbes building soil is to have green plants that are supporting those microbes. And I guess in a way we could even draw the analogy between that and what Colin said earlier about we have to enable farmers to support the economy as well as supporting themselves and their families and everybody that eats. We have to enable these things to happen. So we have to enable microbes to build soil. And the things that we've done in the past without realising it, we have actually been continually inhibiting microbes from building soil, which is why we've ended up with compacted soil, for example, that needs to be now deep ripped. The compaction wasn't there prior to us disabling microbes. So we have to have plants and microbes actually have to work together to produce this fertile, well-structured soil. We have the plant photosynthesizing, feeding the microbes, and then the microbes building the soil. So it's a combined effect, and we talk about plants as being a holobiont. So nearly all the literature now on plant ecology is about holobionts, and what is a holobiont and how does that function? Well, every living thing, including people and ruminant animals, insects, doesn't matter what it is, every living thing is a holobiont. So what on earth is that? Well, in simple terms, a holobiont is the host, which could be the plant or the animal or the person, and their microbiome. So now in the field of human health, we hear a lot about the human gut microbiome, and we realise that human health is largely determined by our microbiome. If our gut microbiome isn't functioning, then we don't function as a whole, as a human being. And together, the living thing and its microbiome make the whole. So I guess it's a bit like holistic management. If some of the parts are missing, it doesn't work. So if we look at the human holobiont, humans as a holobiont, we have 23 pairs of chromosomes that are in every single cell in our body, and as our cells replicate, they carry the genetic material forward into the new cells. But we have thousands of species of microbes in our gut, and all of those microbes have their own genetic material. So our human genetic material is far outweighed by the genetic material of the plant, of the microbes in our gut. And the genetic material of the microbes in our gut has an enormous impact on how we function as a human being, how good our health is, and also there's a very strong gut-brain connection, so that if we don't have adequate numbers of microbes, of different kinds of microbes in our gut, our brain doesn't work properly, and we will often suffer some kind of mental illness like depression or something, and all of the, like the autism spectrum, autistic kids have key microbes completely missing from their gut. So a big connection there between the gut and the brain. But we inherit our genes, our genetic material, our DNA comes from our parents, but we get our microbiome from our mothers. And I'm going to just say very briefly how that actually works for plants. So our genes determine our skin colour and our hair colour, but our microbiome is what actually influences our health. Well, that's enough about humans. Let's just talk about plants now. So in the plant world, the genes determine what kind of plant it is, so that we know a millet plant is going to, the seeds of a millet plant are going to produce another millet plant. I mean, we all know that, and also what cultivar or what variety it is. So that's what the genes do. But it's actually the plant's microbiome that determines its health and, very importantly, its productivity. So how well that plant grows is going to be determined by its microbiome. And that is something that we have largely ignored until perhaps the last 10 years. And this is not very clear, and if you've only got a very small version of it, it's going to be even less clear. I'm sorry, but if you're able to look at it later, you'll be able to see it more clearly on a recording or something. But on the left-hand side, there's a bean plant, and on the right-hand side, there's a rice plant. So we have something in the legume family and something in the grass family. But what this slide is about is all of the microbes that together collectively form the microbiome of that plant. So you can see the level of the soil there. Below the soil, we have the roots, and we have what's called the rhizosphere, which is the area around plant roots. And it's absolutely full of microbes. That's all those little dots that are there on the screen. And then above ground, we have what's called the phyllosphere, which is every part of the plant that's above ground, the stem and the leaves and flowers and fruits and seeds. We have a phyllosphere microbiome, and then we have an endosphere. So everything that's inside the plant also is very, very important for how the plant functions, as it is for people. So I'm just going to show, if I can just, I'm just going to stop that slideshow for a minute. I don't know whether you're going to be able to see me. Can you see me?
We can see.
So I'm just going to show you these. So that's a grass plant, if you can see that, and another, I've got a green plant here. All right, so just very, very quickly, what I want to say about that we have to bear in mind when we think about plants now is, number one, as the same as in the human body, there are more microbial cells in this plant and on this plant than there are plant cells. There are more microbial cells here than plant cells. So how those microbes function in that plant is going to determine how healthy it is, how resistant it is to things like insects and pest attack diseases, how resilient it is in the face of drought stress or frost. I don't know whether you get frost in Namibia, but any kind of stresses, the microbiome of this plant is going to help it to be able to deal with those. It's going to give it resilience. That was the word Colin used, right? Resilience is going to come from this plant's microbiome. So how does it get a good microbiome? Well, I'll just show you this one. So here we have a grass plant, and the seeds of this plant, when you take one of these seeds and put it into the soil, the seed of this plant has the core microbiome for this plant. It has the genetic material, and we've always known that. What we didn't know until about 10 years ago was it also has the core microbiome. So just like in humans, we get our core microbiome from our mothers, and we wouldn't survive without a core microbiome. That seed cannot survive without a core microbiome. Now, its core microbiome is bacteria and archaea and viruses and protists and fungi. All of them, all in there in a little seed. It's in the soil. When it germinates, the core microbiome, all the microbes that are in there, actually come out of the seed into the soil and interact with resident soil microbes. So it's that soil environment is really, really important. If we have put insecticide or fungicide on the seed, which happens in Australia and happens in the United States, you can't even buy commercial crop seed without it having poisons on the seed, that immediately stops that communication between the core microbiome and resident soil microbes. So we're going to run into disease and pest problems straight away. Then we have to use insecticides, then we have to use fungicides. So we create a lot of the problems. But let's assume that we have a healthy soil. The microbes come out of the seed. They interact with resident soil microbes. Then the resident soil microbes and the core microbiome move back into the seed, and they are then in the emerging plant, in the newly establishing plant, and very, very important for its growth. So they then become the endophytes within the plant that, as I said, they're very, very important for everything that the plant needs. It's going to depend on its microbiome, all the nutrients that it needs for its protection from pests and diseases, for its resilience in the face of drought stress, etc., is going to come from the endophytes. Now, when this has completed its life cycle and produced more seed, then if it has grown under good conditions where it's been well managed, and if it's a grass plant, grazing is very, very important for that. The grass that's not grazed is not going to be as healthy as one that is appropriately grazed. Then there will be more beneficial microbes in the core microbiome of the seed for the next generation. So with good management, our plants actually improve over time. And we've always thought that that was genetic, but it's actually microbial. It's all to do with the core microbiome. In a poor situation, in a deteriorating situation, now Colin described a situation where we had one piece of land where we had 3 times the stocking rate, very well managed, had a good grazing plan, good perennial grasses that would have been supporting microbes in the soil. So every year under that grazing plan, those perennial grasses are going to get stronger and stronger, not for genetic reasons, but for microbial reasons. In the other piece of land where the soil is deteriorating, the core microbiome of those plants is going to deteriorate. So my point is, it's not just about genetics. The management is very, very important for what happens to the microbes in those plants, and the microbes are going to determine their future function. And when microbes are transferred from one generation to the other, it's what we call vertical transmission. So you'll see those things in the literature if you look at core microbiome, vertical transmission, plant endophytes. All of those things are the terms that are being used now, and we're talking about soil. All of these things are incredibly important for soil because the only thing that can build soil is a plant and the plant's microbiome. So we have to make sure that we are transferring those things from, let me just see if I can, no, that doesn't work, sorry. For some reason, I can't seem to screen share again. I'll just have to go back to here and get that out of the way. Sorry for that little interruption there. I don't know why it's not possible to. There we go. So why has it taken us so long to realise all this? I mean, this is absolutely fundamental to every agricultural system everywhere in the world, and we've only known about this for the last 10 years. Well, the reason is, my understanding anyway, my interpretation of the reason is that soil microbes are quiescent, that's one way of putting it, under most glasshouse and laboratory conditions. In other words, all of the research that's been undertaken in universities, just for example, or research agencies around the world, has been undertaken in a way where the soil microbiome has not featured. So I spent most of my research career in a Department of Agronomy and Soil Science, and all of the plant roots that I saw while I was doing my research looked like that. Now, if you see, and I thought that was normal. So if you see plant roots that look like that, you think you're looking at a whole plant, you're only looking at half a plant. Because if you can see the roots, then the plant does not have a healthy microbiome, because the microbiome of the plant is going to be on the outside of the roots. It's sort of like when you think about a cow and the rumen, or a human and our gut microbiome, it's inside, but for the plant, it's on the outside, because in actual fact, the plant and the soil form what we call a holobiome. It's a continuum. There should not be any barrier between plant roots and the soil. It should just be a continuum. So what does that look like? Well, it looks like this. Instead of having clean white roots like that, you shouldn't be able to see them. So the fact that there's all that soil sticking around those roots tells you that the plant is interacting with the soil biology, and that the roots have formed what we call riser sheaths. So there's incredible amount of biological activity taking place on the inside of those riser sheaths. That's a little grass plant. And if we just look inside the riser sheath of something like that, on the left-hand side, you have the edge of the plant root. On the right-hand side, you have the soil. And in between, what's happening in that riser sheath, you can see all those, what looks like little silky spider web there. That's the hyphae of fungi, of hundreds of different kinds of beneficial fungi. There'll be mycorrhizal fungi, there'll be trichoderma, there'll be saprotrophic fungi, and they're all taking exudates from that plant out into the wider soil community, as well as feeding everything that's living within that riser sheath. I don't know how well you can see that if you've only got a small version of it, but there's little droplets of liquid on there, which are the plant root exudates. What you can't see at that level of magnification are the trillions, literally trillions, of bacteria and archaea that are also living in that environment. In fact, just even in that photograph, there are probably more microbes than there are humans on the planet. We have something like 7 billion humans on the planet. Well, there's trillions of microbes in there. It's an order of magnitude higher. What are they doing? They're supporting that plant. They're protecting it from diseases. They're supporting it in times of stress. They're making nutrients available for it, and they're building soil. This one's not a grass, so this is a little broadleaf plant. You can see all the soil sticking around the roots, and you can see aggregates starting to form. I don't know whether, if you can't see this very large, you probably can't see my pointer, but I'm pointing to the aggregates forming around those plant roots. These water-stable aggregates are really, really important. I'm going to talk about them a little more later. Now, this is a little vetch plant with a legume, so I'm just pointing to the nodules that are forming there, the Rhizobium bacterium. Well, we don't need to have legumes to fix nitrogen or to support microbes that fix nitrogen if we have aggregates forming around our other kinds of plants. Legumes are only something that you need if your other plants are not forming topsoil. So this is a grass plant that has aggregates, water-stable aggregates, all around its roots. So there's nitrogen being fixed inside those water-stable aggregates by free-living soil nitrogen-fixing bacteria that are not Rhizobium. There are literally thousands of kinds of bacteria in soil and archaea in soil that are able to fix nitrogen, which is why that plant is lovely and green, and it will be an extremely healthy plant. So these water-stable aggregates that you can see around the roots of those plants, we want this grass plant, we want it to feed livestock. And we also want it to build soil. And it will do both at the same time, and will do both better if we manage it appropriately. If we leave it ungrazed, as Colin well knows, it will just become moribund and it won't do anything. So we have to keep it, try and keep it in a vegetative state, and grazing is very, very important for that. So these water-stable aggregates are absolute engineering masterpieces. They're formed. This is just a photo of what soil looks like. If soil is well aggregated, it's not going to be compacted. It's going to absorb moisture. You know, infiltration is going to be great. Water storage is going to be great. Really easy for things to move around in there, for roots to grow in there. We all know that's the holy grail of soil. You actually want it to look like that. Well, those aggregates, those water-stable aggregates, are formed by microbes that are supported by plants. And they're called macro aggregates, the ones that we can see. They form through the combined efforts of bacteria, fungi, and plant roots. And they pull little micro aggregates together, and the micro aggregates are formed by bacteria. So we need bacteria and fungi. And if you've only got sand and sandy soils, fungal hyphae are absolutely essential to mesh sand particles together. Bacteria are not able to do that. So fungi are very, very important for sandy soils. In this photograph here, you can see this is just sand, just basically pure sand. It's all pulled together in lovely aggregates by these fungal hyphae that you can see in this photograph here, which means that we have all these spaces between for air and water. And if we've got free living nitrogen fixing bacteria in here, which we will have because there's plenty of exudates to support them, then we obviously need to have the atmosphere getting into the soil, because the atmosphere is 78% nitrogen, which means there's 78,000 tonnes of nitrogen sitting above every hectare of land. Why would you ever need to buy it? You don't need to buy it, but you need to create the soil conditions where nitrogen fixing bacteria can live and be supported by the plants. And even though it's bacteria that are fixing the nitrogen, you need the fungi to create the soil structure for that to happen. Here's another photograph of sand, just pure sand. See all these fungal hyphae here, pulling it together into aggregates. The fungi are really important for our soils, and we need our soils to be fungally dominated. And if we read the ecological literature that's come out in the last 10 years, the importance of fungi is emphasised repeatedly, and how do we get more fungi in our soils. So water-stable aggregates are the fundamental unit of soil function. If they're not forming, our soils are going to go backwards. So just to look at this diagrammatically, on the left-hand side, we have compacted soil where all the soil particles have just been pushed down against each other and just form solid like a brick. That's where we need to get the deep ripper in and open that up. But we wouldn't have never needed to do that if it was like on the right-hand side, where microbes, the glues and gums produced by microbes, have stuck the soil particles together to form macro aggregates. So there's lots of spaces between the aggregates for air and water to get in, for plant roots to easily grow, and for things like earthworms to move around in there. So again, if you look at this diagrammatically, the blue lines there are water moving down into the soil, and in the middle of those sections we have that's a macro aggregate there. It's got soil particles in it. The important thing about this diagram is that once water gets into a macro aggregate, it can't evaporate. So the other important reason for having aggregates is that water will infiltrate easily and go deeper into the soil, which is where we want it. We don't want the water to be sitting around near the surface, because it's going to evaporate from there. And we want to encourage our plant roots to go deeper. And we also want it to be stored in aggregates so it can't evaporate, but plant roots can get it on the aggregates, because plant roots are actually right inside the aggregates. They help to form the aggregates. So the water-stable aggregates hold moisture within, which provides drought tolerance, and they also improve drainage, which reduces waterlogging in the years when we do get lots of rain. Only plants and microbes working together can produce water-stable aggregates. And of course, plants don't have access to this amazing microbiome in the soil if they're grown under conditions that disable it. So what sorts of conditions disable it? Well, I think Colin mentioned disking, obviously repeatedly disking soil, leaving it bare. or overgrazing it, leaving it bare, anything that's going to interfere with photosynthesis or disrupt the aggregates that are already in the soil is obviously going to disable this entire process. And the other thing is the huge emphasis on fertiliser around the world has probably been one of the worst things that we've ever done. Water-soluble nitrogen, water-soluble phosphorus is very, very bad for the soil microbiome. And one of the reasons is that it concentrates roots, where you put the fertiliser. So the plant on the left-hand side, it's grown in a soil that has nutrients available all the way down the soil profile. And then the next one across is where phosphorus has been applied just in the band, which is what happens. People put phosphorus or put nitrogen under the seed. I'm not sure how widely that's practiced in Namibia, but very widely practiced in Australia. And then the roots just proliferate in that band where you put the fertiliser, and then you have very, very poor root systems beneath that. So we have phosphorus is the second one, then nitrate the third one, then ammonium, which is another form of nitrogen fertiliser. It has disastrous effects on plant roots, which means when you run into a dry time, the roots just simply can't get water. And if you look at this under the microscope, on the left-hand side here, we have plant roots of cereal oats, which is a grain crop that's grown here in Australia, where fertiliser's been used. The roots are completely bare. And as I said, when we have roots that don't have a microbiome associated with them, they can't function effectively. And on the right-hand side, we have the roots are actually in there behind those beautiful aggregates. You can't see them because they have a riser sheath on them. And there's been no fertiliser used on the right-hand side, and there has been nitrogen fertiliser used on the left. I'm not really sure how widely nitrogen is used in your country, so I don't know how relevant that is. But again here, if you can see my pointer, I'm pointing to the seeds of this, in this case wheat, two wheat seeds there. This has had 80 units of N put under the seed, and the roots coming out of the seed are completely bare. And the roots coming out of the crown of the plant have got beautiful riser sheaths. And this farmer put nitrogen under the seed and then came back over and put compost on the top. So he's got both things operating on the one plant. He's got good riser sheaths where he put the compost. And I think that's another photo. There's the plant seed. You see these roots here, totally dysfunctional roots coming out of that seed where the nitrogen is. It's just one of the most toxic things you could ever put near a plant seed. And remember, the microbiome, the core microbiome, is going to emerge from that seed and try and establish some kind of relationship with microbes in that region. What's happened here is that the plant has sent out these lovely roots from the crown away from the nitrogen and formed a good relationship with soil microbes in the zone that's away from the nitrogen fertiliser. So what can we do in place of nitrogen fertiliser? Well, we can use biostimulants, and these are becoming very, very widely used all around the world. Farmers can make their own. They can be there's so many things that can be used as a biostimulant. You only need really, really low concentrations, and all you're trying to do with a biostimulant is actually stimulate the microbes. You're not trying to replace fertiliser. You're not trying to replace the job that the microbes would be doing. You're just trying to stimulate them to do what microbes are really good at doing it. So in most soils of the world, even though we think some of our soils are very infertile, when we analyse them and look for totals, we find that their total nutrient levels are usually fine. There's very, very few soils in the world that have absolute nutrient deficiencies. It's usually due to poor soil structure or a lack of microbial diversity. And then, of course, we use toxic chemicals, insecticides, fungicides, high analysis nitrogen, and that just has such a dramatic effect on microbial populations and impairs soil function. So biostimulants are the answer. Now this is a little wheat plant. The seed is just here, if you can see my pointer. The roots that came down, the seminal roots, have just riser sheaths all the way. This little plant has only got 2 leaves. It has just really got down and got going. Deep roots, very important, building soil all the way down. The crown roots have got lovely riser sheaths on them. And this farmer puts a vermi liquid, which is, he has a little worm farm, and he gets the liquid from the worm farm, and he puts that vermi liquid on the seeds of his crop plants before he plants them. It's an absolutely fantastic biostimulant, and it only needs to be at very, very low concentrations. It's just so that when that seed germinates, what it finds in its environment is the vermi-liquid, and it responds very favourably to that. This is the same farm with oats that are a little bit more advanced, and look at these amazing riser shoots. This is a very, very dry climate where this photograph is taken in the Great Plains area, I suppose it is, of Canada, and very low rainfall environment. So a fellow Australian by the name of Jerry Gillespie, I'm not sure whether you've heard of Jerry, he's actually going to be presenting a webinar on how to make your own fermented compost, to make a compost extract and a protein hydrolysate from animal manure. In other words, you could use cow manure or sheep manure or goats or pigs or anything. Chickens, I don't know whether you have many chickens in Namibia, on the 14th of October, which is next week. And he's going to be presenting that in conjunction with John Wilson in Zimbabwe. So I'm not sure whether any of you know John, or John is connected to some kind of a group. I think they operate pretty much through a lot of countries in Africa. And I would suggest that anyone interested in making their own biostimulant from locally sourced ingredients, mostly waste products, should maybe get back in touch with me, and I'll give you a link to that webinar, because it's really a great way to get away from synthetic inputs. It's a great way to reduce costs. It's a great way to stimulate the soil microbiome, and it's nothing that you need to buy from anybody. You can make it yourself. So you can also activate the soil microbiome through plant diversity. And again, this is where most of the interest has been in regenerative agriculture around the world. I think coming mostly from the United States. So farmers like Gabe Brown have really been leading the way. As Colin was talking about our innovators, Gabe is up there with the innovators, and we've learned a lot from them, because they've just gone out and done these things on their farm, proved that it's worked, despite the universities still telling them that it doesn't work. In fact, there's been several universities, even in the last week in the United States, that have said regenerative agriculture doesn't work. And I just got an email just prior to this webinar from New Zealand, from the policy people in New Zealand, saying regenerative agriculture is just a whole lot of warm, fuzzy feelings and farmers getting together and telling each other how good it is, and it absolutely doesn't work because we have no data to prove it works. Well, that's nonsense, because we have data from all around the world, from real farmers making real change. And one of the things that they are doing is activating the soil microbiome through plant diversity. So rapid soil building, I have seen the most rapid soil building that I've ever witnessed in my entire life, where farmers have switched over from monocultures to diverse plant communities. That has just blown my mind, what diversity does to the soil. Sometimes actually implementing diversity can be a little tricky, but there's absolutely no doubt that it works. So one of the things that happens in a diverse plant community is we have variation in leaf architecture. In other words, we've got leaves of all different kinds of shapes. So if we just have grasses and they form like a V shape, they don't really intercept that much light, and they've got fairly narrow leaves, really, compared to something with, big wide leaves like sunflowers, for example, or soybeans, or I'm not quite sure what kinds of plants you can grow in Namibia, but I think Colin mentioned chili. Well, chili's got, much wider leaves than a grass. So if we have a variation in leaf architecture in our mixtures, the idea is we don't want any light to hit the ground, because then it's wasted. If sunlight hits the ground, it's a total waste. We want to intercept all of the light, and that means that there's going to be more photosynthesis and more carbon actually exuded into the soil microbiome. And that means we're going to be able to support more microbes, and if we can support more microbes, we are going to build soil faster. And there's a lot of research on this now. This is absolutely not warm, fuzzy, just regen ag stuff that, people think works. There's been long-term research trials that have actually shown that plant diversity definitely improves soil carbon and definitely improves soil building. So if we have more microbes, there's a greater chance of actually reaching a quorum. I haven't got time to talk about quorum sensing today, but that is something that's important to this whole way that soil functions. Quorum sensing is how microbes actually make decisions, and they do. They make decisions, they coordinate their activities, they work together and the outcomes of them being able to achieve a quorum and work together are absolutely amazing. And microbes are able to switch genes on and off in their hosts. So the microbes around a plant root can switch genes on and off in that plant, as microbes in our gut, in the human gut, can switch our genes on and off. And a lot of our genes are switched off at the moment because we don't have sufficient microbial activity in the human gut for us to have the health that we should have. But that's another webinar for another day. So we want aggregate formation, we want nitrogen fixing, so we don't have to use nitrogen fertiliser. We want disease resistance. I don't know whether you need frost resistance, but you certainly need drought resistance and flood tolerance. Obviously, droughts oftentimes are followed by a flood. And if we had good aggregate formation, we would have good infiltration of water, and floods would be far less intense than they are. So we can reduce the severity, the intensity, the frequency of flooding by forming aggregates, which again comes back to, all these things come back to photosynthesis and the microbes that are supported by that. Plant diversity, people go, well, how could plant diversity make any difference? It makes a difference because the variation in leaf architecture means you capture more light. And also you have more variety of microbial communities around the plant. So every kind of plant produces its own unique blend of exudates, and those exudates support different microbial communities. And when we have different kinds of plants, we have a community of microbes that can perform many different kinds of tasks. If we just have one kind of plant, like just grasses, then we have a very simplified soil microbiome that cannot do everything. Like one kind of microbes cannot do everything that needs to happen in the soil. So our natural herblands, I call them, I used to call them grasslands, but they were herblands. Now, in Namibia, I can't say for sure, I've never been there, but certainly the prairies in the United States, the meadows in Europe, our Australian native grasslands were herblands. So they had 500 to 700 plant species in a fairly small area. In fact, I was on a ranch in, what's the name of that? Oklahoma last year, where we did some monitoring. We found 760 ground cover plant species. I'm not talking about trees or bushes, around 760 ground cover plants that were all edible on that one ranch. So there were hundreds, and only like 10% or so of those were grasses. The others were all forbs and flowers. This is a photograph of a tallgrass prairie in Illinois, which is a state in the United States. There's hardly any grasses in there. And that's what tallgrass prairies were like. Well, what happens is that when you bring livestock into that, they will eat the forbs, because the forbs are highly nutritious. They have high levels of secondary plant compounds. Feed conversion efficiency is very high on forbs. And as soon as you have any kind of unmanaged grazing, you're going to lose your forbs. The grasses are far more tolerant to grazing, and so you end up with a grassland which was originally a herbland. I'm not going to say any more about that, really, other than one of the things we can do in Australia to replace our grasslands is put in these kinds of mixes. These plants may not grow in Namibia, but they will grow here, and you can see we have a diversity of root architecture there. And a diversity of leaf architecture, and we also have plants from a range of different families, and that's what's really important. So on the left we have plantain in Plantagenaceae, we have clover, which is in legumes, which is now called Fabaceae, we have chicory, which is a daisy, which is Asteraceae, and so on. Ryegrass is the Poaceae. So we have all these different plant families, and that is the key thing about diversity. If you said we're going to have a 12-way mix, that's not 12 different kinds of grasses. That you want to have it like at least 4 plant families in there, and examples from each family. That's how it works. So there's been a long-running biodiversity experiment in Jena in eastern Germany. It's been running for 15 years. They looked at 1, 2, 4, 8, or 16 different kinds of plants and 4 functional groups. So their functional groups were grasses, legumes, short herbs, and tall herbs. And they looked at biomass production and beneficial insects, soil microbial activity, water balance, soil carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, all kinds of things. And I've just realised I'm running out of time here, so I'm just going to quickly here, because this may not necessarily be of any interest to you, but what they found is that biomass increased as the number of plant species in the mix increased. So over, if you look, the number of species are on the bottom there, 2, 4, 8 or 16. Plant biomass is on the axis on the left-hand side. More species means more biomass. Well, actually, this is of interest to you, even though the plants are probably not the same kinds that will grow in Namibia. But if you're a livestock producer, you will have more biomass through good grazing management, but you'll also have more biomass if you have more diversity in the forage base. And I guess for the lands that we were talking about that Colin mentioned, where there might be, say, 10 to 20 hectares and maybe 2 hectares of that might be grown to a crop and the other 18 hectares might be grazed, well, this would be very, very important to have those 4 functional groups in there in that forage base, and they can all be perennials, will really improve the biomass production. And of course, it needs to be managed in a way that's going to maintain those plants. So the high diversity plots in the Yenna experiment also produce more than 20% more soil carbon. So if they had 8 or 16 different kinds of plants, then they got 20% more carbon than 1, 2 or 4 different kinds of plants. So it's very important for soil building, and that's been proved scientifically. No one does things more rigorously than the Germans do. It was an incredibly well set out and well researched trial that they set up. They also found that soil depth increased as the number of plant species in the mix increased. So just in this little diagram here on the left-hand side, we just have 2 kinds of plants, a grass plant and a forb. And when there's only 2 kinds of plants, it just doesn't form deep soil. On the right-hand side, we have 6 different kinds of plants, and the soil is deeper. And this has been found around the world. As a consequence of plant diversity, you can build deeper soil, which also means that moisture can infiltrate to deeper, and all the things that we want the landscape to do in terms of landscape function are going to be improved by deep soil. I'm just going to skip over this because I'm going to run out of time. I'm sorry, but high diversity, 8 or 16 plant species produce more biomass than 8 or 16 plant species with no fertiliser produce more biomass than 1 or 2 plant species with 200 kilos of nitrogen per hectare peak. Right, some of the things that you might be able to incorporate, flax is a possibility, linseed, in the Linaceae family. It's an annual, but it's an excellent soil builder and absolutely non-competitive. You could put this in with anything. Like it could be mixed in with the millet or anything. It will not compete with other plants. It's a very slim little tiny plant, but incredible root system and incredible soil builder, highly mycorrhizal plant. If it grows in Namibia, I don't know whether it does, but that's one of the ones that we say can go in almost any mix if it will grow. People growing vegetables at home or small-scale vegetable producers, put flowers in with your vegetables, mix everything in. Get root mingling, get your veggies to mingle their roots, because if the roots are in contact with each other, they will grow better. Obviously not to the point where they're competing, but try and mix things up. All of the flowers in this photograph here are edible. We have to get more edible flowers into our vegetable production, into our diets, put them in your salads. There are, 100 or 200 edible flowers. Mind you, there are also some flowers that are incredibly toxic. So make sure you know what you're eating. I don't want to be responsible for anyone's death. And we're seeing more diversity in farmers' fields as well as in vegetable production. You'll have this slide anyway, so you can look at this later. This is just a mix. This is just one example of a multi-species forage crop that doesn't require any fertiliser, just because of the diversity that's in there. That's what it looks like when it's coming up. And when we just pulled some plants out and looked at their roots, look at the lovely riser sheets. So Colin also mentioned about monitoring, like what can we look for? Sure, there's a lot of things you can look for with satellite. You can look at bare ground and that kind of thing. But, for people actually on the ground, growing crops, growing vegetables, growing forage for animals, you need a spade. You need to dig plants up. You need to check that they have riser shoots. You need to check that that plant is actually communicating with the soil, that it's all just one. The plant and the soil has to become one, and then it works. This is a plant that I love for Australian dry conditions, sheep's burnet, or it's just called burnet. It's in the Rosaceae family. It's perennial, it's drought tolerant. This is the only thing that got through. We had 3 years of massive drought here. Our water deficit, our rainfall deficit was 1.5 metres. We got 1.5 metres less rain than we would have in the last 3 years. This thing just kept on growing green throughout the drought, never even looked back. Absolute and highly nutritious for livestock. That's a close-up of the flowers. This is another one, highly drought-tolerant chicory. It's in the daisy family, has an incredibly deep taproot and will punch through just about anything. This will get through compacted soil, unbelievable. Highly nutritious for animals, fantastic for cattle. Improves their feed conversion efficiency, and in dairy, it's become just like almost every dairy farmer in Australia and New Zealand has chicory now because it increases milk production. This is another one that's a great plant, evening primrose. It's perennial, it's drought tolerant, highly nutritious. Yarrow in the daisy family, perennial, deep taproot, breaks up compacted soils, lots of trace elements. And plantain that farmers here used to spray out at one time because they thought it was a weed. One of the most nutritious things that you could have in your pasture, very drought tolerant. Not sure whether it grows in Namibia, maybe in some of the higher rainfall areas. It's very cold tolerant as well as drought tolerant. So my last 10 minutes, grazing management matters. As Colin has been saying, well, he knows it all, so I don't really have to say very much about this, but it's not the cow, it's the how. So we're always blaming cattle for landscape degradation, and poor things, it's not their fault, it's how we silly humans have mismanaged them. So when we're talking about grazing management, we're obviously talking about appropriate grazing management, and appropriate grazing management is going to revitalise and restore, regenerate landscapes. Inappropriate is going to take them the other way. So one of the things about grazing management that we have learned from research is how much of the leaf you take is very important for what happens to the roots, and what happens to the roots is very important for what happens to the soil. So if it's possible to manage stock so that they only take 50% of the available green leaf, or less if that's possible, it will not affect the root system at all. No effect on the root system if they can come in and just take 50%. And what happens then is that the plant recovers incredibly quickly. It doesn't have to rebuild roots. It's got plenty of photosynthetic material left, and you can come back and graze again in a very short amount of time. So a very quick graze that only takes a small amount of photosynthetic material is also going to allow you to come back very quickly. If you take 90% of the green leaf that's on offer, it has a very, very detrimental impact on root systems. And I'm going to talk about shrub encroachment, or a bush encroachment, sorry, you call it, we call them shrubs, in a moment. And if you just remember this diagram, look at that 90% use and look how short those roots are on those plants. And you'll see why we have around the world bush encroachment where we used to have grasses. So if we look just from an animal production perspective, it's really important to notice that most of the energy and the protein and the nutrients are actually in the most recently emerged leaves. So animal live weight gain and fertility are higher if only the top half of the plant is grazed. So if we just go back to this one, if you go out into the field and with a pair of scissors, if you cut a plant in half, or cut maybe 20 plants in half and put all the top halves in one bucket and the lower half in another bucket, and send those samples off to the lab, it will come back showing you that there is nearly always double the protein, double the energy, double the trace elements in the top half. So you think, well, how would we get animals just to graze the tops? Well, they're not silly. You put them into a paddock and it's good management. They will just skim. They'll just walk through and skim the top half off all the plants. And then when they finish that, they'll turn around and then they'll come back and take their second bite. So they're taking the most nutritious part. So in actual fact, your live weight gains will be higher if you only graze the top half of the plant, and then plants will recover more quickly and you will be building soil. So grazing management is very important. If you graze them into the ground, future production is reduced because they have to use root energy to regrow their tops, and that takes time. So it's going to be longer before you can come back in, and also you're going to actually be encouraging bush encroachment, which I'll show in a moment. So this is a very famous photograph that's used in every country of the world, and I'm sure you probably have it in Namibia. But on the left-hand side, we have plants that have just been kept short forever. This is in a glasshouse experiment, and if you keep plants short, you're going to have short roots. There's just there is no way the plant on the left-hand side can possibly have a root system like the one on the right-hand side. Now, if you look at that one on the far right, you think, oh, it's got a better root system than the one. So in actual fact, what this photograph matches this diagram. It actually comes from this diagram. So this diagram, you have 50% use, 70% use, and 90% use. That's of the green leaf. In this photograph, on the left-hand side, you have that's 90% use. The next one along is 75% use, and the next one is 50%. Only 50% of the green leaf has been removed at each time. The one on the far right has never been grazed. And you would think, oh, well, look how deep that root system is. But in actual fact, if you look closely at those roots, the ones at the bottom are dead. So it's not a living root system. The one that's the 50% use has actually got fresh, actively growing roots and is building soil, whereas the one on the right is becoming moribund. And yes, it has deep roots, but they're not doing anything. So the 50% use is the way to go. So how does this grazing management relate to bush encroachment? I've got 4 minutes left, but I think I can do it. So this is a diagram from one of the western states in the United States and in a dry environment. And the reason I've put this up, you'll probably be able to see it more clearly when you look at it later, is that what we call shrubs, what you call bush, has much deeper root systems than grasses. And so what happens is, so in this diagram, we have a bush on the left-hand side. You can see how deep the roots are. And then the other plants that are shown there, some of them are grasses and some of them are forbs, but none of them are grazed in that situation. So what happens is if we then come in and just graze the forbs and just graze the grasses and the shrubs the bushes not being touched, well, it then has access to all the moisture that everything else would have been accessing before. And so it now has a competitive advantage. We have created a competitive advantage for the bush by inappropriate grazing of the forbs and the grasses. And I just threw this photo in because it's from the Kalahari Desert, and you're probably familiar with this tree. It's called shepherd's tree. It actually has roots that go down more than 70 metres or 230 feet. That little tree there has roots that go down 70 metres or even further. They only measured them down to 70 metres. Can you believe that? There's no way a grass can ever compete with something like that. But we then give a competitive advantage to things. So we've inadvertently provided this competitive advantage to deep-rooted bush by inappropriate grazing of the perennial grasses. We've shortened their roots. So if we look at this diagram here, on the left-hand side you have some grasses, and on the right-hand side you have a little bush. And look how much deeper the roots are. So this one was actually a scientific article about evapotranspiration and where the water goes and how the hydrology works in arid landscapes. But you can see that any water that penetrates to depth, the bushes are going to get it and the grasses won't if we have not allowed their roots to get down deep. We have to graze our grasses in a way that enables the roots to get down to compete with the bush. And the other thing is that when every time there's a drought, the situation gets worse. You'll notice, and I'm sure that now that your drought is broken and it's rained, that you will have even more bush coming back because the grasses have been inappropriately grazed or overgrazed during the drought, and then we've got all that bare ground, we've got bush plants with deep roots. They can get the water that's there now, and they've got nothing to compete with them when it rains. So what's happened in Australia is that millions of dollars have been expended trying to remove bush with fire. We said, oh, well, we'll just burn it. That will get rid of it. And all it has done is create more bare ground, made the problem worse. So it looks like this after it's been burned. I mean, bare ground is the problem. Bare ground is the reason why we have bush encroachment. And so we burn everything and then wonder why the bush gets even worse. Well, so we have to do something about our grazing management, and Colin is the expert when it comes to that. And the other factor in Australia, I'm not sure whether this is a factor in Namibia, is that prior to European colonisation, there were a lot of small ground foraging mammals like bilbies and bettongs that were not grazers, but they did eat the shoots of newly emerging bush plants. So they liked the dicotyledonous plants. They would preferentially graze those. In fact, they'd never graze grasses at all. And that we think that that was also a big factor, that we had livestock unmanaged grazing created their ground, like you see in that photograph. There was no habitat for the bettongs and the bilbies and the potoroos and the other small mammals that lived in the original grasslands. They were predated on by cats and foxes. They're now nearly all extinct. We don't ever see them. And so the bush has had the opportunity to germinate in all this bare ground that we've created, and there's nothing that eats it. I know that in some parts of Africa, elephants do quite a good job on keeping bush down. So I'm not sure whether you ever had elephants in Namibia, but sometimes there's nearly always more than one reason that something becomes a problem. It's a case of having these interacting factors. So if you have introduced livestock consuming grasses and then loss of the native animals that actually consume the trees, then of course you're throwing everything out of balance. So 6:31, well, what would that be? I'm not sure what time that will be in Namibia, but that's my hour. So that's it.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Jones. It's actually 9:30, and that was a 9:30. That was a very, very insightful and technical presentation. I just want to remind our audience that this presentation will be available on the Bank Windhoek YouTube, just for you to revisit and go step by step as you apply. We have come to the end of our presentation for this morning, but we'd like to invite questions from our viewers for Colin and Dr. Christine. Dr. Christine, I have some couple of questions, but I want to start with Colin. I have one question for you, and I know that you have worked extensively in this area. So the question is, what about conservation agriculture? That's directed to you during your presentation. So maybe you can start with that, just give us a small highlight on that in the context of your presentation, and then I'll come back to Dr. Christine.
Thanks for the question. I think conservation agriculture in Namibia anyway has been around for at least 10 or 15 years. The ministry has very good strategies and policies and enabling environment for it. One of the approaches which Christine was commenting on was the ripper furrowing, which has been done, is a conservation agriculture approach. It is minimum tillage, so we haven't yet got to the point where we're looking there at zero tillage, but conservation agriculture has a real role to play in Namibia, particularly to start with in the communal areas. And this applies also to the green schemes of the country, where regenerative agriculture would play a major role, but also the commercial farming cropland sector. I think many of the things Christine has been talking about is highly applicable to us. We do have a growing group of farmers in the communal and commercial crop farming sector who are recognizing this, and I think this is additional information which Christine has provided, which I think is going to help us take this to new heights, to move from conservation agriculture, where appropriate, to regenerative practices.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you very much for that. Dr. Christine, I have one question here that I want to read to you, and it says, what techniques are available for livestock farmers to assess soil improvement at regular intervals, example annually, for monitoring progress in regenerative livestock farming practices? Is testing for soil carbon one method? So that's one question, but I have also a few questions for you. Maybe I can just read all of them, then you can sort of have a collective answer. The other one is quite interesting to us, part of your last slide, is what impact does fire have on soil regeneration? And the next one is, what is the best thing to do after bush thinning an area to ensure it regenerates from there? And the fourth one is, what should we as farmers do to ensure our soils regenerate for crop and livestock scenarios? And the next one is, for the northern communal areas, if we are using reaper furrowing under rain-fed conditions, what would be a good species mix to include between the rows, and how best would you go about it? The second last question is, in cropped areas, how best do you incorporate livestock when one cropping season only allows for a single crop? And the last question is, apart from the crop fields, in our small, well, small is less than 1 to 20 hectares area, have parts that are not cropped and are left as natural vegetation. How could we best increase the productivity of these areas for livestock and own use? So I hope you capture all that, and then maybe you can just take the floor and try to go through with us one by one. Thank you very much.
Well, Maria, as I mentioned right at the beginning of my presentation, everything comes back to photosynthesis. So everything that a farmer can do to maximise or optimise photosynthesis is going to help. I think if people understand that the process that they're working on is capturing light energy through photosynthesis, transforming it to biochemical energy in the form of carbon compounds. Some of those carbon compounds are going to be used to build the plant, and some of those carbon compounds are going to be used to build the soil. We want to be building plants and building soil at the same time. Unfortunately, in the past, we've done things to try and build plants, for example, put synthetic fertiliser on, but that has inhibited the relationship between the plant and the soil microbiome. So yes, we have built big plants, but they haven't built soil, and then you end up with compacted soil, and if you don't have good soil structure, then you can't hold water. And so over time, that becomes a degenerative process. You can make a plant grow, you can force it to grow, but over time the soil deteriorates, and then you not only lose plant productivity, but you lose landscape function as well. So that we have, it exacerbates droughts, it exacerbates floods. We have to, in every scenario, whether you're growing vegetables in your home garden or whether you're, managing livestock over thousands of hectares, you have to remember that what you are actually managing is the photosynthetic process, because that is the only thing that is going to bring life to your soils, and also it's the only thing that's going to generate wealth, because we have to be thinking about the flow of energy in terms of sunlight energy and carbon compounds, and then generating wealth, which then flows on to the rest of the community as well. So even, people living in urban areas are going to benefit if farmers are maximising photosynthesis. So all of the questions that are around that, like, so how can we monitor it? Well, one thing that you can do, I don't know whether this is widely used in Namibia, but you can use a refractometer to measure bricks levels. Do people use refractometers, Colin? Do farmers use refractometers?
There are a few farmers who are using it, but it's not widely used now. So I think to talk a little bit about that would be very useful.
Right, so a refractometer is a small device about the size of a mouse on a computer. It measures the refractive index of the sap in the plant. So you're going to get a little bit of, you take some leaves and you put them in a garlic crush, you get some sap out of the plant, you put it on a plate on the refractometer, you just hold it up to the light and look through it, and you're measuring the refractive index of the sap of the plant. If it has a high refractive index, that means that the sap is full of minerals and trace elements and sugars, and it's an indicator that the plant is photosynthesizing at a high rate. That's what I use a refractometer for, to tell me how fast is my plant photosynthesizing. If it's photosynthesizing at a high rate, it is building itself and building soils and feeding microbes, and it also means that it will be far more nutritious for livestock. I did have a figure that I was in my presentation, and I took it out because I wasn't sure whether bricks was used in Namibia, but there is almost a straight line, like a line that goes like this, between live weight gain in terms of kilograms per day and bricks level. So if you look at a Brix level is the percentage of solids in the sap. If you look at Brix level starting at like say 3, which it often is in New Zealand in ryegrass pastures, and then go up to 30, which we see sometimes in Australia in well-managed situations. So that Brix from 3 to 30 is like live weight gain from like say half a kilo a day to like 3 kilos a day. It just makes an incredible difference to livestock production if plants are Brixing at a high level. So how do you get them to Brix at a high level? Well, as I explained before, it's all to do with the energy that's in the plant. It's going to be how you manage it. If plants are grazed into the ground, they are going to have low Brix levels because they've had to use a whole lot of energy to regrow their roots, so they're not going to have a lot of energy in their leaves. And just on that whole thing of grazing management, there was something I was going to mention if I did have time, so I'm just very quickly going to mention this. Colin, when we were speaking last week, you mentioned that Dick Richardson, who used to be an inhabitant of South Africa and is now with us here in Australia, and Dick has come up with a grazing method that he calls grazing naturally. I'm not sure whether you're familiar with that, but it's based on a 12-camp system. The 12th camp is called the Sabbath paddock, and the first one is called the priority paddock. And every year it changes around so that what was the Sabbath this year becomes the priority paddock. And the way it works, and Dick being Dick, he uses a beer can. So if my pen was a beer can, so a beer can standing upright is when the grasses get that high, in the priority paddock, they're grazed. And they're grazed to the height of a beer can lying on its side. So you never graze them right down the bottom path. So beer can standing up, Dick, you could just imagine him explaining it much better than me. So that's your priority paddock. So as soon as it gets down to a beer can on its side, they're out. And they go into paddock number 2. And you graze each of those paddocks like that, all the way up to number 12, but you never ever go into number 12. It's left for a whole growing season recovery. And what happens with that system, and you have to come back to number 1, you have to come back to the priority as soon as it gets to this high, because what Dick has found is that if you keep putting pressure on those grasses, when they get to the beer can height and then you come in and take 50% out, it really makes them grow. It's really amazing how coming back, you never let them get moribund. So what happens is your priority paddock gets a lot of attention for one growing season. And then in a really good year, you're going to have heaps more grass than you can ever do anything with. You'll never get anywhere near number 12. You might get up to number 6 or 7 or something like that. Then you've got to come back to the priority again. It's a really interesting system because next year, the one that was grazed and grazed and grazed this year is now going to have a complete rest for a complete growing season. It's going to be able to produce. It'll have good root. It makes really good root systems grazing them like that. It will have produce lots of seeds and things like that the next year. And then your Sabbath that was rested for a whole year, it now becomes the priority. And sometimes you may need to, because the Sabbath paddock has just been left and it's become moribund, Dick says you may actually need to burn that with a cool burn to get some fresh regrowth on that. But you're only doing it like it's a one-off. It's not going to be a hot burn. There's a huge amount of difference between a cool burn and a hot burn. Yep. They are just not the same things. And our problem with people trying to stop brush or bush encroachment by hot burning, they are incredibly hot burns and they just scorch the ground, and sometimes it was years before anything ever came back. So we can have a cool burn to take the top off those moribund grasses in the Sabbath, and then you've got green regrowth, and you're just going to measure that, do that, the beer can up, the beer can down. And it seems to be probably the best grazing method that I have seen in Australia on our rangelands. It seems to be. He's only come up with this a couple of years ago, and it's being widely adopted because people are seeing that it works. Now, in a drought year, what's going to happen is that you're going to use every one of those camps except the Sabbath. You're going to use all 11, and you're going to have to destock as well because because you can never go below that beer can. You absolutely cannot graze down below that beer can height. So you've still got that safety valve of destocking, but you are going to, in a good year, you're going to have far more grazing pressure on some of the plants than you normally would if you were grazing all of the camps, which is good. And you're going to have some of them resting completely, which is good. Yep. So what happens with the kinds of grazing plans that we have at the moment is that everything gets grazed. to some extent, and sometimes it's mediocre. Everything gets grazed to a mediocre extent, if you know what I mean, because it's really hard when you're trying to impose the same kind of grazing management across all the camps. It's really not easy. And you know, we've got some very sophisticated some very sophisticated what was the word I was going to use, like technical support, that's not the right word, but things like Maya grazing and those kinds of things to help farmers make those grazing management decisions. But the great thing about this grazing naturally method is that you actually don't need a computer program to help you. You just need a beer can. So the thing about fire is a cool fire and a hot fire is they're different things. I don't have any problem with fire if it is a cool burn, provided you're using you know why you're using it. If you're using it to get rid of bush, that's not going to work. But definitely to stimulate grasses to get them going, and then you need to graze them appropriately after that. I wouldn't put fire as a high priority for me, and Dick Richardson only says that he would use it in an emergency where you had, you know, grass over your head and there was nothing else you could do other than you've got to get it down to be vegetative to actually graze it. So fire is a tool to be used very, very carefully, definitely not routinely. And the great thing I like about grazing naturally is because you move everything around every year, every camp is going to get different kind of treatment every year, and nature thrives on diversity, not just diversity of plants, but a diversity of disturbance regimes. And when we get into a habit or a pattern of repeating things over and over, like when people started erecting cells, you know, for cell grazing here in Australia, on the circular pattern with the water point in the centre, and just staying on the same rotation, created all kinds of issues. You know, once you get into that like recipe kind of approach, it doesn't work. So what else was I? So the other question was bush thinning. If we thin the bush, what then? Well, for heaven's sake, don't go back to doing what you're doing before, because that's how you ended up with bush encroachment. So you're going to need to do something different, and your grazing management is going to be incredibly important. In some places, it's just going to be too dry to establish anything other than relying on the seed bank to regenerate for you. It's incredible how resilient those seed banks can be, provided you haven't had massive erosion and all your topsoil's been washed away. In some places, in a good year, you actually can establish some plants, and you know, there's various methods for doing that, like you can just throw some seeds out in the ground and put a salt block or a mineral block or something out there to attract animals to, you know. I'm sure Colin is familiar with all those kinds of things. I don't want to go into too much detail, but there's definitely ways that you can re-establish things, or even just sometimes if you've got bare ground, just some high animal impact, just concentrating animals in a small area, get lots of dung and urine. Like dung and urine really stimulates the soil microbiome as well. So you've got bare ground and you just put some hay there and just get some animals, you know, stomping around on it and then get them off and let it recover. I mean, assuming that it rains. This is one of the problems, isn't it? That, you know, you have to have the seasons with you. And it looks like, in Australia at the moment, it looks like we're coming back into a pattern where there is rain. So there is an opportunity to do those kinds of things. You're wasting your time doing any of those kinds of things in a drought because nothing can grow anyway. So you obviously have to be, you know, looking at the long-term forecast and what the weather's going to do. Species, I'm not really sure I wouldn't have a clue, really, what grows in Namibia. I did give you some examples in those slides. Some of those things I just tried to pick things that were very drought tolerant and that we have seen to be drought tolerant here under 3 years of very, very below average rainfall. Whether or not they grow in Namibia, I can't say, but they will be there on the slides anyway, and they were perennials that I showed you. What was the thing about the simple crop? I don't quite... Maria, what was that question about a simple...
So how best do you incorporate livestock when our cropping season only allows for a single crop?
Oh, a single crop.
Yeah.
So you mean on the 2 hectare or the 1 hectare area that's got millet or something on it?
Yep.
Yes, well, that's a good question. So one of the things that they've been trialling in the United States when they've been growing a monoculture of something like corn, for example, is to double the width of the rows but have twice the number of plants in the row. So you still have the same plant population per hectare, but because the rows are wider, you get a lot more light actually coming to those plants, and they've found that the plant yield is the same. So corn is grown in 30-inch rows normally, which is 30 inches, what's that, about 3/4 of a metre or something. And they've taken it out to 60-inch rows, which is 5 feet, which is, how many metres is that? Not quite 2 metres anyway, it's like 1.5 metres or something like that. So they've gone from a 30-inch row to, it must be the only country in the world that's still imperial measurements, and I find it really hard to figure it out. So they've doubled the row width, they've doubled the plant density in the row, but there's still the same number of plants in the whole field. And then they've got this like a 5 foot, like say almost a 2 metre space between the rows of corn. So they've been able to plant a multi-species forage in there, which is going to be building soil, providing lots of diversity. You get lots of insects coming in, you know, beneficial, you know, things like, you know, parasitic wasps and all kinds of things that provide lots of protection for your crop, and butterflies, and, you know, like just a whole, you just improving the biodiversity of the farm incredibly. And then when you've harvested your corn, then you can bring livestock in and graze the whole thing. So then you get dung and urine and animal impact, and they'll eat what's left of the corn stalks, and they'll also eat the forage that you've put in there, which could, you know, have a whole range of things in it, like a really diverse mix of things. So you'd need to look to see what would survive in your environment. You know, where you're growing millet, obviously it's very dry, and if the yield is like only 400 kilos per hectare, it's a very dry environment. But there would be certainly things that will grow, and you would know more about those things than I would. Like just a range of legumes and forbs, try and get daisies in there. I don't know whether sunflowers would grow at that low level of moisture, but there might be other daisy plants, even things that people put in their gardens like zinnias. Cosmos is a good one. If cosmos I have seen growing wild in South Africa, all along the roadsides. It's in the daisy family. Animals just love that. You will never see that in a grazed field because that'll be the first thing that they'll eat. So actually cosmos might be something like in the millet rows, cosmos and other, you know, get some daisies and get some plants from different sorts of families, not just grasses. In fact, if millet is in the rows, then you don't want any grasses in the bit in the middle. You just want that to be all non-grass plants, some drought-tolerant legumes and things, and then come in and graze what's left of the millet stubble and your forage. And honestly, what it will do for soil will be just amazing. So, was there anything else? And in terms of what to measure,
you can just round up, Doctor.
Sorry?
Please round up.
Yes, Maria?
Just round up.
Okay. All right. Well, I think I did answer. We definitely measuring soil carbon is going to be important, but that's expensive. Like, it's incredibly expensive to measure soil carbon. So I think if farmers keep good records and they're measuring things like bricks, they go out with a spade, they're going to have to dig a hole, they're going to have to look at the roots of their plants and make sure that they have riser sheets on their plant roots, and maybe look at even at root depth. Maybe just dig some holes and have a look to see how deep the grasses, how deep the roots are going down. So look at the roots. It's really important to see what's going on in the soil. Use bricks to measure your plants to see how fast it's photosynthesizing, and obviously all the other things that, you know, everybody's already aware of, ground cover, percent ground cover, you know, all of those kinds of things. What kind of species diversity is there? You know, most of those monitoring things, there are already good monitoring, you know, monitoring, what's the word for it? Like checklists. Yep. There's monitoring checklists already available.
Thank you so much, Dr. Christine. Thank you, Colin. With that, ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of the first session of the Windhoek Agriculture Series. I want to thank our speakers, Mr. Colin Nott, and of course, Dr. Christine Jones, who has been our guest speaker for today, as well as our audience for participating in this very, very interesting and exciting event. As mentioned to you earlier, this is a 4-part series, and we will continue this afternoon at 3 p.m. with an interesting discussion on organic agriculture, food and nutrition, with speakers from the Namibia Organic Association and the Nutrition and Food Security Alliance of Namibia. We again would like to thank our partners, the GIZ, the Namibia Nature Foundation, and the Namibia Organic Association for giving us this very, very exciting discussion on agriculture. From me, Maria Immanuel, and from Colin, and from Dr. Christine, all the way from Australia, thank you very much. Have a productive day, and see you at 3 p.m. right here on Windhoek Facebook and YouTube Live. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria.